Okay, so in this video we're going to continue going through World War II in Europe. So in our next video we will expand World War II to talk about what's going on elsewhere, but our focus in this video is mainly going to remain in Europe. So we left off in the last video when Germany invaded Poland on September the 1st, 1939. And to Hitler's surprise, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. Two weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. And Germany and the Soviets each take half of Poland. And remember, this is a secret part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Along with this, the Soviets forced the Baltic countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to sign, mutual defense agreements with the Soviet Union. And after World War II, those three countries will be taken over by the Soviet Union. So they will be added to the Soviets. They also tried and failed to do the same with Finland. But the Finns fought back and remained independent. This does bring up a really interesting but kind of outside the scope of our course story about Finland, because Finland is right in the middle between the Soviets and the West, and so Finland had to chart a very dangerous course so they don't anger either side too much, and Finland could have become a war zone during the Cold War, but thankfully for Finland, they were able to navigate that course pretty well. So Finland remains free. Now, for the next few months, Germany is mostly focused on Eastern Europe. It's not until April of 1940 that Germany finally turns their attention towards France and the United Kingdom. So Germany finally attacks France, and France was going to wait for Germany. So Germany finally attacks France, and they use a tactic called Blitzkrieg. So Blitzkrieg in English means lightning war. So this tactic involves two pieces. So first, bombers attack the defensive lines. Then trucks or trains move soldiers as fast as possible. And no one in Western Europe was ready for this. No one was ready for this, even though it was used by the Germans during the Spanish Civil War. But in any event, no one that was fighting in this war was ready for this tactic, and France surrendered in June of 1940. And this sets up a German-backed fascist French government called the Vichy government. And you might see this referred to as Vichy France. So now, all that remains is the United Kingdom. So only the UK is standing against the Germans and the Italians. Germany decides, like so many others have tried to do, to try to starve out the British and force them to surrender. This takes two forms. First, Germany starts using their submarines again. And so they attack all of the shipping coming in and out of Great Britain. And this is called the Battle of the Atlantic. And this was very effective. That is, until the British decoded the German military codes. The Germans had a very elaborate coding system, and they had this machine called an Enigma machine. And basically, it created completely random codes that you needed another Enigma machine to decode. And the British couldn't crack this until they got their hands on one of these. So they found one, and then they could begin reading German military communications. And that helped them fight back against the submarines. The other way that the Germans were trying to force the British to surrender was through their air force, called the Luftwaffe. So the Germans relentlessly bombed British cities hoping the people would force their leaders to surrender. But the British famously never surrendered, and the Royal Air Force fought back and slowed the German forces down. So really, it was the Royal Air Force that prevented the Germans from completely bombing the British into surrender. Now, one more thing about the French before we move away from Western Europe is that the French usually are the butts of jokes because they surrendered. The French surrendered, and the official French government was fascist. But the French people kept fighting. And so while the French government was fascist and they collaborated with the Germans, and unfortunately sent about 75,000 quote unquote undesirables to concentration camps. So French Jews, French homosexuals, French communists. So the French government was fascist, but there were a lot of French people who kept fighting the Germans. And so there was a very robust resistance campaign, which was basically a bunch of guerrilla fighters attacking Germans wherever they could. And so this was really dangerous work. And so while, yes, the French surrendered and there were a number of French collaborators, there were just as many really brave French people who fought back against the Germans and took these very dangerous steps to keep fighting the Germans. Okay, so this is what's going on in Europe, and this will pretty much remain that way until the Americans get involved in the war in 1943 in Western Europe. So now we're going to turn our attention back to the East and look at the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. So this is known as Operation Barbarossa. So everyone knew that eventually the Soviets and the Nazis would fight. Nobody knew when it would happen, and nobody knew who would attack whom first. But it turns out that the Nazis attacked the Soviets first. So this happens on June 22nd, 1941. And so Germany, having now pretty much subdued the French and the British, they invade the Soviet Union using those same Blitzkrieg tactics. The problem, though, was that unlike the French, the Soviets could just keep retreating, drawing the Germans deeper into the Soviet Union and farther from their supplies. So the Soviets just kept moving farther and farther away and letting the Germans keep coming further and further into the Soviet Union. While they were retreating, the Soviets were preparing for this invasion. So the Soviets built nothing but weapons from like 1940 onward and moved them east, understanding that they would be retreating from the Germans and moving east. And so eventually, the invading Germans met a huge Soviet military response. And the Germans were really far away from Germany. So to give you an idea of how big these battles were, we have millions of soldiers involved in these conflicts. 150 invading German divisions were met by 360 Soviet Army divisions. The Soviets drew the Germans into a trap. This was all supplied by British intelligence, and American steel. And so it's often said that World War II was won through British intelligence, so knowing what the Germans were doing, American steel, so the Americans were basically lending the Russians vehicles, planes, tanks, weapons, and British intelligence, American steel, and Russian blood. So the Russians are going to lose a lot of soldiers in World War II, more than any other country put together. So the Germans have now found themselves in this trap. And the Russian winter is coming. And the big battle happens in the city of Stalingrad. So the big battle / turning point in the war happened at Stalingrad. This is in 1943. This was the first major defeat for the Germans. And it was really important. The German plan was to move through Russia, so move through the Soviet Union into the Middle East to get access to all that oil. And had the Soviets not stopped them at Stalingrad, they would have pushed into the oil fields of the Middle East and then had all the fuel they needed to do whatever it is they wanted to do next. But it came at a horrible cost. 2 million people died in this battle. And the city of Stalingrad was 99% destroyed. But the Germans were stopped. The next big turning point in the war does not happen in Europe. It happens on the other side of the world, and we will pick this story back up in the next video when the war eventually ends. But just to segue into where we're going, the Americans will join the war in late 1941. And just like they did in World War I, the Americans will tip the balance to the Allies. And so in our next video, we will talk about what's been going on in the Pacific this whole time, and we will finally wrap up the war. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.